Good afternoon. So given that I live at the theater capital of the world, New York City, it won't surprise you that I see a lot of Broadway. And a lot of what I see are musicals. And given that I'm a voice teacher, it probably will not surprise you that I have considerable opinions about singing that's going on Broadway. There's some scary singing going on 8 shows a week on the Great White Way. A couple of years ago, I chaperoned musical theater students from Wagner College's Summer Musical Theater Intensive attending a final performance of Newsies. We were granted a talk back with the cast, and the students were really eager to know what it was like to perform that show 8 times a week on Broadway. We're very excited. And not surprisingly, the cast said that it was exhausting, grueling, and admitted that they really relied on the show's physical therapists to take care of their bodies so they could perform Christopher Gattelli's breathtaking choreography 8 shows a week. I was so impressed that Disney thought to take care of their actors in this way, taking care of their bodies. How wonderful. And yet I got to thinking, what about those thick Bronx accents? Is there a vocal therapist on staff to take care of the gentleman and lady and make sure that they're vocally aligned? Well, no, unfortunately not. And I see that as a problem because we're entering an age in which vocal issues for musicals are becoming more ambitious. This has a lot to do with the pop rock influence on the ever-changing genre. And then the vocal demands for the singer, of course, are greater as a result. And contemporary musicals demand more dexterity from the singer. When I came to New York about 15 years ago, singers maybe had like 6 to 8 songs in their book. Now, try about 20. Just look at this year's best nominated musicals for the Tony Award: Bright Star, folk; Hamilton, hip hop; School of Rock, rock; Shuffle Along, vaudeville; Waitress, contemporary pop. Musical theater performers should have each one of these songs, at least one of these songs, in their audition book, if not more, in addition to their healthy diet of golden age and contemporary repertoire, right? But on top of that, they have to make sure that they understand the stylistic markers of each of those particular genres of contemporary musical theater. I love that I'm seeing people nod. That's awesome. They have to understand these markers and how to incorporate them into their technique, and that takes a lot of work. And finally, move over, Annie. There are significant demands for younger theater artists. Consider shows like Miss Hilda, Billy Elliot, Tuck Everlasting. And I think we can also include young professionals, shows like Newsies, of course, Rock of Ages, and Spring Awakening. Now, shows like Matilda have, coming out of the Royal Shakespeare Company, they have a vocal plan in place for their cast, which is awesome. But for a lot of these young performers, they're flying without a net. So without sounding too paranoid, this is a huge issue. Now, and given that I'm a voice teacher and a musical theater composer, I felt compelled to start a conversation about how to both prevent and treat vocal health issues on Broadway. But the problem is this: how do you prove there's a problem? I mean, I hear it, but how do you come up with something that's quantifiable? Well, that's really easy. That's really hard to do because in general, performers are not eager to wave the white flag of vocal distress. It is very common for Broadway performers to have vocal fatigue be a natural part of their week. It's generally not talked about. And more serious complications are usually not discussed for fear of affecting one's career. Actors Equity does not monitor vocal health issues, and according to Timothy Try in the Audition Center, there has not been a show that has raised the red flags regarding the amount of cast replacement auditions on a show. I also asked about information regarding workers' comp for those suffering vocal injuries. I was not given any information. I was sent to the New York Workers' Comp Board, and you can just imagine how far I got with them. And finally, there's no database of information of the shows and how many cast replacement auditions there have been. So good luck proving there's a high rate of turnover for certain principal roles on Broadway. Well, I decided to look at 2 shows, Jersey Boys and Wicked, to compare roles and see how long actors played those roles or how many people had played those particular roles. So we're going to look at Frankie Valli in Jersey Boys and Elphaba in Wicked. Frankie Valli. There have been 7 Frankie Vallis in the last 10 years with 6 standbys. Now, this is actually quite good, considering that the general contract for a Broadway run is, or for a Broadway contract for an equity actor is usually 9 to 12 months. This is actually really lovely. One speech pathologist I spoke to praised this particular production for their healthy rotation of actors to make sure nobody becomes overly tired. And Jersey Boys also has a boot camp for Frankie Valli's and other principal roles to make sure that they're taken care of. Also looking at IBDB, which is Internet Broadway Database, where I got this information, I saw that a lot of the standbys became full-time Frankie Vallis. So they were kind of trained into that role. And also, you see John Lloyd Young, who originated the role, came back in 2013. So it was this rotation. Very, very healthy. Now let's look at Alphaba and Wicked. Yes, exactly. There have been 18 Alphabas in the first 10 years with 9 standbys. That is 27 Alphabas in the first 10 years. Now, is it fair to say the high rate of turnover has to do with vocal health issues? No, it's not fair to say that. But I have to ask the question, how many women have hurt themselves in the hope of defying gravity? Can I get an amen? There are other roles where I see a high rate of turnover. Sherry in Rock of Ages. 11 actresses played that role in 6 years with over 5 standbys. Again, really high rate of turnover for a Broadway show. Okay? Now, all of this is fascinating to me, but I still longed for more concrete facts. So I decided to go to the source and speak to Broadway performers of all ages and levels of professional development to get their experiences. First, in a 9-question anonymous survey, and then for those of them who were interested, I did a one-on-one interview. I have to say the response I received was overwhelmingly positive. People were really interested in having this conversation in the hopes of helping people coming down the aisle, which was beautiful. I sent the anonymous survey to about 100 musical theater performers. About 30 of them responded. Here are the questions I asked. How many Broadway shows have you been in? More than 75% said of those responding had been in 2 shows or more. Have you ever suffered vocal fatigue after a show or a week of shows? 85% said that was normal for them. I know. I know. We're going to compare that statistic to something else in a little bit. What was the cause of vocal fatigue? This was fascinating to me. Look, less than 10% said illness. I thought that would have been much higher. Over 55% said it had to do with schedule demands and the demands of the role. And I think that's very telling. I asked how long the vocal fatigue lasted. More than 2/3 of the performers said it lasted for 2 days or more, with more than 1/4 of them saying it lasted for 5 days or longer. And what's more, almost 1/4 of the participants said they had suffered temporary or sustained vocal damage because of a Broadway production. That is far too high a percentage. Now, because vocal fatigue and injuries are understandably very sensitive topics for musical theater performers and any performer in general, of course, I have chosen to create a narrative from their interviews in a way that hopefully outlines industry standards currently, while also humanizing the information. I began to ask each performer if they or a colleague of theirs had ever suffered vocal issues in a Broadway production. Almost all those I interviewed said they had. Here are some specific responses. Kevin Massey, who was the understudy for Huey Calhoun in Memphis on Broadway and is currently on tour with A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, candidly shared his experience. He said, "They usually happen when I have a long run over 6 to 8 months. In one case, there was a particular note I had a quote-unquote buzz on. I asked the musical director if he'd heard anything, and he didn't. I asked my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and she said she heard it a little bit. It was something I had to resolve on my own. I had to either go to a teacher or figure out how to maneuver around something." Christina DiCicco, who played the title role in the matinee and weekend performances of Evita on Broadway, had this to say. "Yes, I've seen cases ranging from fatigue to polyps, cysts, and nodes. The resolution depended on the specific case. Performers go on strict vocal rest regularly as preventative measures and also for healing purposes. And I've seen people retrain as a sort of vocal physical therapy or take leaves from jobs to have corrective surgeries." Darius DeHaas, who's currently performing in Shuffle Along, explained, "In general, if someone had some sort of vocal distress, often they would go into an ENT and, if necessary, be put on vocal rest. If you're a lead in the show and the weight of the show is on your shoulders, that's very difficult. Sometimes, in those cases, they're given prednisone. I don't think that's something that producers would think about. It's up to the individual actor." Prednisone was a common denominator among those seeking to resolve temporary vocal issues. Now, some vocal issues or injuries came as a result of being cast in something that wasn't exactly right for the performer. On this note, performers actually had a lot to say. Kevin Massey shared, "For the Queen musical, We Will Rock You, they flew me out to Vegas to audition, which never happens. One of the creatives said to me, 'It sounds quite nice, it's quite riveting, but it sounds like it needs to hurt more.' And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I do that? Do I want to do that? If I had gotten the job, I would have found a way to do it, but even if the sound wasn't exactly what they wanted. Amy Justman, who's currently understudying Carlotta in Phantom of the Opera on Broadway, explained, "The current role I understudy does not lie comfortably within my range, which has been extremely frustrating. All I can do is work on it a little each day, see my voice teacher weekly or every other week, and hope that it gets a little better with time. I have to remind myself that 2 to 3 tough passages does not make or break the role. I'm also planning to see a massage therapist who specializes in singer-related tension." Thankfully, Amy has the support of one of Phantom's musical directors, Richard Carsey, who she praised in her interview. Jason Forbach, who was in the national tour of Les Miserables and currently plays Enjolras on Broadway, pointed out that brief rehearsal periods can often compound vocal issues. He says, "People either have to learn on the job or crash and burn. Music is always shortchanged in the process, yet singers are always expected to deliver. There may be one day where the music is addressed, and even though the music is really the reason for the piece's existence." That's what's really so amazing to me. It seems that we're seeing a trend of the music being a conduit for the acting, whereas I feel good music should be the channel on which the character rides. Many actors spoke of the extraordinary challenges they've had on Broadway tours, which resulted in either fatigue or injuries. Jason continued, "I had bad allergies the entire 3 years of touring, flying, hotels, and old theaters. Sometimes if you're operating on 60 to 80%, that's a good day. You're never at 100% health. You had a bad meal at the airport. There's something in the air vent in the hotel. There's no way around it. You just have to do the best you can and hope your technique will carry you through." When I asked performers about how creative teams supported them during these difficult times, I got varied responses like, "None. It's usually up to the performer," or "Not much. I was made to feel guilty, and if I called out and they don't pay for the doctor or the drugs." And finally, creative teams have been understanding of the need to occasionally mark in rehearsal. Also, I've never felt strong-armed into going on when vocally compromised. And my favorite response that I got in terms of what creatives did, "Ha." So there's definitely some support out there for singers, but there also seems to be what I would call a pervasive paranoia around vocal issues and how it might affect one's career. Les Mrs. Jason Forbach continues, "We had one girl who had a lot of vocal issues, and she did the best she could, but her colleagues knew she had vocal problems, and she wasn't granted an audition for other things if there wasn't a cover. She doesn't know. Very often, people don't realize their behavior in the moment can either get them or lose them the next job. And it will be someone who's watching who you don't even know is paying attention." Toria Campbell talked about, Toria Campbell, who was in Book of Mormon and Lion King. She also played Gladys on the national tour of Sister Act. She talked about the mental and emotional hurdles performers jump through when dealing with vocal issues. She says, "It's incredibly hard to realize and accept that some things are out of your control. Helplessness is frustrating. At the end of the day, everyone is always supportive and encouraging. Do what's best for you. You're not a robot, Toria. But the challenge is not to let those feelings of failure creep into your brain." Now, to me, all of this highlights the fact that there really is no universal protocol when performers are not at their best. In an effort to further unpack this, I reached out to 5 Broadway musical theater musical directors, in the hopes I might gain knowledge from their experience. One of them felt they were not qualified to answer my questions, and the other 4 did not respond. Similarly evasive were casting directors. After numerous attempts to speak to several of the major New York casting directors, I was unable to get a response. I was able, however, to speak to Cindy Rush and Allison Frank, casting directors who focused less on Broadway, but cast a lot of off-Broadway workshops and new works. They had some invaluable insights. Now, given that the audition is where all of this begins, I was eager to find out how casting directors guide the creative team to hiring someone who will meet the requirements of the show's roles while also making sure that to avoid vocal health issues. I first asked them how much time they spent with the score of a musical, and Cindy Rush said, "Most musicals go through so much development. I have a chance to learn the show over the course of at least 2 to 3 readings, usually 6 to 12 months. Musicals often move from a table reading to a 29-hour reading to a production, and during that time I'm able to learn what the vocal constraints are for the show, i.e. how tight the harmonies are, which track needs bass notes, which character doesn't need to sing as much, etc. I asked if it was solely up to the musical's composer to come up with the vocal ranges for particular roles, and Cindy explained that it's a process. She said, you want to make sure you're all talking about the same thing. If someone says, I want a Kelly O'Hara voice, that's great, but which Kelly O'Hara do you want? Pajama Game, Light in the Piazza, Bridges of Madison County? I work very collaboratively and ask a lot of questions. I won't just look at an email and say, oh, you want this voice type. I think all of those questions need to be asked before you get in the room. It's a matter of being specific. It's both the voice type and how the composer thinks about musical genres. There are a lot of moving parts, and everyone has to have a say. So you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Where vocal issues are concerned, Cindy shared, casting has a responsibility to play devil's advocate and by saying, what are you going to do if this becomes a problem? What kind of research do we need to do? Can we talk with someone who's worked with this person and get a stamp of approval? Do we need to hire a vocal coach to alter the score? There's so many options. None of them fall in the laps of the casting director. Our job is to lift up the options and make sure everyone's good with them. I asked one question of everyone I interviewed for this presentation. Whose responsibility is it to make sure the singing actor is taken care of? Both Cindy and Allison had thoughtful responses. Cindy said, I don't think it's just one person. I really don't. I think it starts with the actor. They have to know what they can and cannot do. If you're in a situation when there's some hesitation, then producers need to step up. The musical director goes to the director and says, there are some issues we didn't see here before. And Allison posited, I think it's the singing actor's responsibility. If the actor takes on a role that could be vocally taxing, it's in their best interest to sing through the score, see how hard it could be, and ask themselves, can I sing this score 8 shows a week? They can negotiate a matinee actor or a strong understudy. But not being aware of the potential difficulty can be damaging. I just want to insert here that that idea, I think, is something we need to plant in all of our clients and performers, musical theater performers, that they can ask for things when they're negotiating contracts, because that's really, really important. So what about preventative efforts? Well, I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Peek Wu and Dr. Lucian Salika, two very gifted and well-respected voice doctors that are kind of beloved by the musical theater community in New York. Dr. Wu said that none of his patients come to see him for preventative care. Dr. Salika said it depended on the performer's background. He said if they were coming out of training programs that suggested monitoring evaluations, they were more likely to be proactive about their vocal health. When asked what were the most common vocal issues faced by musical theater performers, Dr. Salika shared, usually it's a bit of vocal fold swelling due to overuse or having to sing sick. The more substantive things are things like vocal fold hemorrhages. There are some lesions I think of as classic musical theater lesions. There's something called a pseudocyst, which is very common in women, and it's not acute. It usually presents as acute because the pseudocyst has become swollen because of a perfect storm of taking on too much allergies or an illness. That's a very common one. Dr. Wu added, there can be a wide variety of causes for their issues. Usually, the musical theater performers are very young and fit. It's really more of a vocal overexuberance, maybe related to an illness, pushing through an audition or a performance or doing multiple rehearsals for another show. Sometimes they're simply under stress and their vocal cords are inflamed or edematous as a result. He further noted, we don't see many experienced Broadway performers who regularly get into trouble, or if they get into trouble, it's because of an illness. What we're used to seeing is the less seasoned singers. They may not have a voice teacher, or they're not as familiar with the demands of the role. The role may require a particular type of belt they're unable to sustain in a healthy way. Those are the patients who we will ask for an independent singing voice evaluation. I asked who is most at risk to suffer vocal injury, and again, they had similar answers. Dr. Wu said, what we're seeing is more of a demand for the younger singer. We see a lot of college singers who, from all over the country during showcase season, who are highly anxious. There seems to be more of that hype. We're seeing a lot more children singers, too, because of musicals like Matilda. I haven't noticed as many children performers on Broadway as in the last 10 years. That might be something that's real and long-term. I do think singers who are being put into the musical theater arena at that young age don't always know how to sing. They're going more for the sound versus technique. Dr. Salika outlined 3 groups of individuals his office most often sees. They include the 19-year-old performer, a musical theater program freshman, hitting an intensity they haven't seen before and crashing and burning. The 25 to 28-year-old, usually female, that may be getting their first sizable role 8 times a week or have been in a show for a while and get injured. And then the aging performer, God help us, which shockingly starts at mid-30s. They're fewer, and they tend to be war horses, he says. They already have a good instincts about how to negotiate difficulties. They're coming more to learn how to adjust their behavior from an examination. Now, as you would expect, the range of treatments depended on the severity of the vocal issue. I was impressed that Dr. Salika and Dr. Wu were both committed to handling treatment in the most non-invasive way. Dr. Salika explained that there are really 3 ways of treating vocal issues: medical management, behavioral management, and surgery. Of behavioral management, he said, in many respects, it's the behavioral management that ends up being a testament to their commitment to the career because it requires an effort on the performer's part. Going to the pharmacy and popping pills, that's easy. Lying down, getting a general anesthetic, and having something taken off your vocal cord is less easy, but it doesn't require a lot of buy-in. Committing to changing your vocal behaviors? When it comes to phonotraumatic injury, if there's any one component I had to pick as being the most essential, it's probably behavioral management. Dr. Wu is similarly interested in finding the simplest path to vocal health. He said, is there a way to help that component either through over-the-counter medications or other treatments? Can we make the environment better so these last longer? Maybe it's something as simple as taking a shower before the performer goes on. Sometimes these simple options can be very effective. Now, Dr. Salika passionately spoke about the importance of making decisions based on data. He and his team have made some extraordinary finds about vocal fold hemorrhages that are at papers coming out this fall. I highly recommend you look out for it. I could talk about it for the rest of the session, but I can't. So check that out. Related to this, Dr. Salika also spoke about the importance of not, quote-unquote, catastrophizing vocal issues. He made this beautiful analogy. He said, "Catty corner from us is the hospital for special surgery. And in many ways, sports injuries are analogous to voice injuries. They're high-intensity usage injuries. If you're a baseball pitcher and you go over to see somebody about your shoulder, no one is going to say you've been abusing it. No one is going to say your pitching technique stinks. No one is going to say that it's your fault, even if it is. The focus is on analyzing how the patient got the injury and rehabbing. If part of that is improving technique, so be it. But the whole mood is different than vocalists." I asked Dr. Wu if he had advice for musical theater professionals, and he had this to say. Most musical theater professionals know the difference between healthy versus not healthy singing, but they may need to have lessons so they can incorporate it into their singing. I don't think a good number of people who perform on Broadway know how their technically musical theater singing may be different from classical or jazz or pop or rock. That's where I would say the patient needs to work with someone with experience in musical theater. It may not just be your classical voice teacher. There may be a variety of different types of singing they need to become aware of. It's important the singers hone their intelligence. It's not okay to switch from classical to musical theater singing. I see some of those troubles too. It's rather complicated, but that's where, being in New York, it's easy to recommend teachers. I'm incredibly grateful to all the Broadway people that I spoke to. And it got me wondering, how does this compare with other musical theater communities? And so I decided to look at the West End and Melbourne, which is the theater center for Australia. Now, because I didn't have personal connections in these locales, it was more difficult getting interviews with people. I had to go through agents rather than connecting with some of my buddies on Broadway. What was interesting to me was that the West End was rather tight-lipped. I would reach out to an agent, and they would positively respond on behalf of their client to do an interview with me. And then once I sent the questions, all of a sudden the walls went up. They cited contractual obligations, or they simply didn't respond, even after cordial back-and-forth emails. I want to start this section on the West End with a Broadway performer, Charles Brown, who transferred to the West End after playing Smokey Robinson in Motown, for which he received a nomination, Tony nomination for Best Supporting Actor in 2013. He said, "I have noticed a huge difference in the stamina between London and Broadway productions. The West End vocalists don't seem to be able to accomplish the 8 shows a week as consistently as on Broadway. There have been multiple actors calling out very frequently due to vocal issues, much more than their Broadway counterparts. Even the swings, whose job it is to cover the regular cast when out sick, haven't been able to rise to the occasion dependably. They have also been known to call out of the show with vocal problems for longer than a few shows in a row. It's been quite surprising to discover, actually. I think this may be due to the fact that on the West End, performers are used to being supported with a pre-recorded vocal track for most ensemble numbers. But our show, with an all-American creative team, doesn't use backing tracks. Everything is live, as is the standard on Broadway. I think the performers here don't have to build and strengthen their instruments, and what I'm witnessing is the result of that culture." Now, this is one person's thought. I shared this with some Brits, and they had some other thoughts that maybe did not match this, but I wondered if this maybe shed some light on the fact that the West End performers didn't want to speak to me. Now, I understand how difficult it would be for a stranger to reach out to any one of us and say, "Hey, you want to talk to us about your vocal issues?" So I do take that. But because of the diligence of my colleagues, I will say that I have made some great headway into talking to some otolaryngologists, speech pathologists in West End, which will happen actually after this presentation. Now, 2 performers I spoke to were actually open to talking about their experience. Oliver Thompson, who currently appears as Galileo in We Will Rock You in the West End, and Amy Lennox, who's playing Lauren in Kinky Boots. I similarly asked Oliver and Amy if they or the colleagues had suffered vocal issues during the run of the show, and Oliver explained, "One person did develop a polyp and had the choice of pulling out of the show or just plowing on until the end of the contract. They plowed on and sounded rocky, but we knew they were struggling. Since then, that person, I believe, has completely recovered with rest, vocal therapy, and fundamentally changing their singing technique. Producers in the UK are not particularly supportive or understanding about vocal fatigue and injury, which is why we plow on for fear of getting the reputation of being precious. Stupid, really." Amy shares her personal experience. "During previews for a West End show, I got laryngitis and was prepared to go off, but because it was previews, I was asked to come in. I took steroids for 5 days. Not something I would advise, but I spoke to my vocal coach and we decided that as long as I mimed group numbers and didn't push my solo, and then went on voice rest at all other times, it would be okay." Now, I think I'm not alone in saying this is not a treatment plan we would recommend for any of our singers. And yet it seems that West End performers are much more likely to fly without any sort of safety net, even more than their Broadway counterparts, who we've already outlined don't seem to have consistent support as it is. Oliver noted, "In an ideal world, our union would be stronger, and a better understanding of the voice should be explained to MDs and producers. But in reality, the buck stops with each individual performer to decide whether to give into the pressure and push through or take vocal rest. Everyone's threshold is different." Now, I realize I'm painting a very bleak picture of musical theater in London. And while there's not much hope to share at this point, Oliver does give us a ray of sunshine through the clouds. He says, "I have to say that We Will Rock You would never expect the lead characters of Galileo or Scaramouche to do 8 shows a week. Being one of the first shows to incorporate high-intensity rock music into a show that plays 8 times a week, they learned very quickly that the songs of Freddie Mercury were rarely sung even by Freddie with all the high notes once or twice a week in a concert. So to expect someone to do that 7 to 8 times a week was silly. It should have been the case with Rock of Ages, but it's doable for a year or so. But after that, I can't help but feel even the most resilient will notice some fatigue." And with that, we're going to turn to Australia. I will say I will continue to reach out to performers, to musical directors, ENTs, to make sure I have a more well-rounded picture of what's happening in the West End. This is not the end. So Melbourne is the heart of the theatre community in Australia. I actually just returned from Melbourne a couple of days ago. I had the opportunity to present a 2-day workshop for the New South Wales chapter of NATS in Sydney, and it was a wonderful experience. And I had a chance to be in Melbourne for a couple of days on the end of that trip. Now, it will not surprise you that musical theatre professionals in Australia combat the same types of vocal fatigue that their Broadway and West End counterpoints do. In her 2012 paper, Perspectives on the Impact of Vocal Function of Heavy Vocal Load Among Working Performing Musical Theatre Performers, speech pathologist Deborah Filand outlined that approximately 2/3 of the 49 musical theatre professionals she and her colleagues interviewed indicated it was normal for them to have regularly feel vocally tired, to have a lowered speaking voice, or to have a reduction in the normal pitch range when they're involved with a show. Now, you may recall that statistic being pretty close, though slightly lower than my anonymous survey. Jacqueline Dark, who has had an extensive career both in opera and in musical theatre, can currently be seen as Mother Abbess in the touring production of Sound of Music in Australia. And she explained her challenge from switching from a musical theatre production schedule from a opera schedule. She said, "It took me a while to get into that groove and learn to pace myself with a huge show load, which was second to nature to other musical theatre performers. Musical theatre is relentless, and any illness or vocal issues can easily and quickly be exacerbated and compounded without the vocal rest that the world of opera affords a singer." Amy Leipheimer, who is currently playing Maria in Sound of Music in Melbourne, generously shares her experience of playing Sherry in Rock of Ages, that high turnover show I was mentioning at the beginning. She said, "Rock of Ages was my first experience as a lead with a big vocal load for a long season. I was thoroughly prepared, but encountered vocal fatigue as the weeks went by, and found it difficult to assess when I was healthy to perform or not. It's a hard decision when you feel you have a lot to prove and pressure yourself to deliver. I chose to push through some shows when perhaps I shouldn't have, which then caused me to need to have vocal rest periods of a few days. I didn't do any damage and returned quickly, but it became a bit of a pattern. I've since worked more thoroughly on my technique, and with a few more years of experience, I now have a better gauge of my vocal health." What seems to be radically different, though, is how vocal issues are treated and prevented in Australia's stationary and touring productions. Amy continues, "I worked with Debbie Filand. She had some tough but fair words for me during Rock of Ages that I had to stop being a people pleaser and worrier and figure out what was best for me and my voice." Now, Deborah was hired by the producers of Rock of Ages to work with the cast. Gareth Keegan, who is playing the role of Galileo in the Australian tour of We Will Rock You, shares, "I found I was becoming exhausted physically, which was affecting me vocally. I asked for a vocal coach as the strain was coming from the scenes, not the songs. The producers brought in a vocal coach to watch the show and give us exercises to help." Elise McCann, who's currently playing Miss Honey in Matilda on tour, relates similar support from producers. "I've witnessed trouble on 2 different shows with 3 different actors. In all situations, our producer and musical director have been incredibly supportive and diligent in helping the artist. They have been thorough and detailed in their assessment, firstly providing sick leave to enable complete vocal rest for anywhere from 36 to 72 hours. If the problems persist, the music department worked specifically on additional warm-ups and restorative practices, and the company both times organized for the artist to have vocal scopes and be assessed by Deb Filand. In one case, a colleague had a cyst, and the company organized, paid for, and supported the artist through surgery and recovery and back into work, even though it appears that the cyst had been there prior to starting on the show. I have been very impressed by how producers and the music department in the shows I have worked on take vocal health very seriously." Yes, if you can believe it, producers in Australia keep voice therapists on staff for their productions. Isn't that beautiful? Matilda's Elise McCann continues, "We have 2 full-time people in our voice department, one primarily working on accents and vocal technique, and the other focused on vocal health." That's Deborah Filand. "Plus our 3-person music department and a full-town company physio. We are incredibly supported on the show, and it pays off because things are caught early and treated with respect." Lynn Ruthven, one of Australia's most prominent casting directors, assures, Most producers I've worked with are very insistent on performers receiving vocal treatment and not soldiering on. I can't remember having to replace a cast member outright during a season. Most producers I work with have Deb Filand or someone similar on standby throughout a tour. Now, you notice Deb Filand's name that keeps coming up. We're going to come back to that in a second. Now, this high level of support doesn't just come from the producers, of course. It also comes from the creative team, especially the musical directors. I spoke to Luke Hunter, who is the musical director for Sound of Music on tour, and he had this to say. I think supporting the actor is probably my first line of defense. Can I help them with the passage they're struggling with? Can I support them when they're not feeling 100% to get through the shows successfully? Can we change phrases? Can the sound department assist? Are we making sure they're warming up, cooling down, taking care of themselves? I like to check in with performers regularly to see how they're traveling. In terms of protection, if I feel they've been booked for too much publicity on top of performances or the rehearsal schedule is too punishing, I'll say something. I think it's more my job to help the performer get through the busy and difficult times. Still, he explained the challenges of gauging performers' capabilities during auditions. He said, the tricky thing in casting is deciding who can get there with work, is you want to reward and encourage those performers, but working out who won't make it. The last thing I'd want is to have someone cast in a role that it was too difficult for them. I hate seeing someone lose confidence in themselves. I've gotten it wrong in casting. I'm prepared to admit it. I blame myself each time, not the actor that struggled. Detoy Brendekamp, who currently plays Rolf in Sound of Music, spoke of Luke's support when he wasn't taking care of himself. He said, during interval or intermission, our musical director came up to me and suggested that I might not be quite ready to come back to work and that I should take care of my voice first and foremost. So I finished Act 2, went home, and was bedridden for a couple more days. It was so interesting to note that while I felt too proud to stay home from just a simple cold, the musical director cared enough about the quality of the show and my recovery to encourage me to stay home and get well. I think that shows how much the industry here in Australia cares for their performers. This level of ownership and collaboration is so refreshing and astounding to me. But before we ship everyone off to Australia, let me say that not every Australian producer is this kind to their cast. Gareth Keegan notes, the support does differ from show to show. In my experience, it has been a reactive way of looking at it. Once something happens, the resources are ample, but I think it needs to be more of a preventative plan of action so it never gets to the ENT or speech pathologist. Again, Jacqueline Dark notes, it differs from show to show. Some producers will force a sick singer on stage, but luckily, most are incredibly careful and protective of their casts. So why is Australia so different? Well, the common denominator here is Deb Filand. Deb Filand has been a pioneer of vocal health for the musical theater community in Australia for almost 2 decades. Her list of credits would take up the rest of the session. So suffice it to say, she's worked on scores of stationary and touring Broadway productions. She's also the resident speech pathologist at Melbourne Theatre Company for over 15 years. And she also maintains a private practice where over 60% of her clients are musical theater performers. I've thankfully had many opportunities to talk to her about the work she does. And I asked her what the work she does looks like. She outlined the following. Establishing vocal fitness and optimal vocal efficiency for show requirements, individually tailored vocal warm-ups, cool-downs, and exercise programs, adjustment to the vocal approach used for specific aspects of the show if practical without compromising the creative aspect, optimization of general health and well-being, including psychological and physiological aspects, and finally, intelligent management of vocal load outside of the show. So getting more specific, Deborah explained that it was customary for the actors in her productions, wait for it, to get scoped before rehearsals start. She also then does a full risk assessment of the vocal score and makes recommendations to the creative team about, I know, right? To make sure that they can foresee challenges. Now, I asked her the idea of outlining differences between classical singers and musical theater professionals, and she stated, The difference between classical and musical theater is about the vocal fitness. It's the only genre in which you'll have to sing this often without any big breaks. Now, I'm not a proponent of complete vocal rest on days off unless the performer is really in strife. It can be useful, but it's better to keep things moving or doing some massage exercises. I will set up a program to do warm-up or cool-down or make sure there's a specific plan for days off so they don't go completely into shutdown mode. I don't think that's psychologically healthy. Now, of course, all of this requires very tricky maneuvering around the creative team. She has to keep in the realm of vocal science without being too scientific, without being overly technical. And shows like Warhorse and Matilda that came out of London, they have their own vocal plan in place. So she had to figure out how that worked and give advice to the actors through their processes. Now, Deborah explains that there has been an attempt to have a speech pathologist on a Broadway production, but unfortunately they overstepped their bounds, and so they were fired by the creative team. So it's a very delicate balance. And she said even sometimes performers are resistant in working with her. She says, I have to win them over. The ones who are hard to work with, usually men, sorry guys, are those who say, oh, I have chords of steel. They'll be respectful but not attentive. When they do actually have problems, they're the ones who are usually the most needy because they get such a shock that their folds have let them down. As I outlined earlier, the level of support Deborah provides to productions is not seen across the board. When asked why, she said, there are a couple producers who believe it's the performer's responsibility. There are just certain shows I know I'll have to work with the performers reactively. They don't want to create a vocal paranoia. Now, fortunately, these producers seem to be far and few between. Deborah explained that the cost-benefit analysis of preventative care for musical theater professionals far benefits the producer. In Australia, it's been the producers of Les Miserables and Disney theatricals, Lion King and Mary Poppins, that are paving the way for this to becoming an industry standard in Australia. Now, while Deb's work has been far-reaching, I noted some other reasons why there was a healthier attitude toward the voice in musical theater productions. First, all productions are mandated to have a group physical and vocal warm-up with a musical director prior to the show. Now, this would never happen on Broadway because of equity rules regarding half-hour. But it's so wonderful that there's this community that is formed and that there's this sense of engagement around vocal health. Also, most shows playing Australia are imported. Lynn Ruthven, a casting director, explains, if it's an overseas show, I would be sent over to learn the show from the overseas casting director, the creative team, and I would watch the show several times. I'd be given a script and a score. I would be given the vocal requirements from the overseas musical supervisor and the MD. So what this means is they're given all of this information up front, where a lot of Broadway counterparts are having to build it from the ground up. Right? So they have a lot of information to decide risk assessment right up front. And finally, Australian actors were much more willing to discuss their vocal issues than any other group of people I interviewed. And when asked why, Deb said this had a lot to do with the fact that many high-profile performers had been very public about sharing these issues and not making it taboo. So performers were focusing on getting better, not trying to hide their symptoms and issues. I know we're nearing our time, and I'm going a little over. I apologize. Stay if you're able. Some takeaways. I asked each performer to give me some takeaways of things that would be important for us as teachers to know. One said, look at each song and understand the dynamics it calls for. Pace yourself and carefully select the moments that require your full power and those that allow you to take it easy. Keep exploring your options vocally and do what you have to do to stay healthy. Another performer suggested, don't volunteer to do things in rehearsal, either key change or take a higher harmony, you won't be able to maintain for a long period of time. Now, this sounds like really logical advice, but you have to think about the young, eager musical theater professional who has a lot to prove. That's actually really good advice for them. This thread of stamina is something that Jason Forbach from Les Mis picked up on as it relates to young professionals. He says, there's a difference between wanting to be the star and being a working actor. I see a lot of entitled young actors come into the show, and all I can think is, you're going to learn this the hard way. You can't just have an upset stomach and decide not to do the second act. DeToy Brendekamp, who had this important insight for young performers about knowing your limits. He said, "It's funny, when you leave drama school, you are convinced you are able to play any role and sing any part. But when you start in the industry and you truly understand what 8 shows a week really means." Recently, I auditioned for a musical that required me to sing relentless A's in perfect straight tone. It was the worst audition of my life. And I realized I will never put my voice through that much strain because there are people who can easily sing that 8 shows a week, and I am not one of them. Now, I know I am not the only teacher that talks to their students about vocal fry. And this idea of speaking is something, healthy speaking voice is something Jacqueline Dark picked up on. She said, "The one thing I have had to work on is keep my spoken dialogue in a properly supported position. There's quite a bit of dialogue and sound of music, so it's important to perform that with good technique as it is to sing properly. I think that's often forgotten by performers, and you neglect the spoken voice, even in everyday life, at your peril." Several actors talked about the importance of having a strong relationship with the sound design team in a production. Motown's Charles Brown notes, "When a singer can't hear themselves, they tend to push or overproject to compensate, and that causes extra strain. I'm always sure to have a relationship and constant dialogue with the sound department so that I can have the levels I need in order to do my job best and maintain for the week." An anonymous tip from a very smart singer: maintain the discipline of working your voice outside the show. Otherwise, your ability may shrink down to the exact limits of what your role demands. Dr. Lucian Salika had some sound advice. He said, "Monitor your total voice use. Performers compartmentalize between their performing voice use and their non-performing voice use. They go out or wait tables to make money and wonder why that has consequences with their singing voice." Several performers I interviewed had some great advice for musical theater writers, which I'm going to pass on to the BMI Musical Theater Workshop in New York, which I am honored to be part of. Matilda's Elise McCann shares, "Write the notes required to match the emotional journey and arc of the character in the song. If the notes and lyrics truly match the emotion and the truth of the story, then the actor will be able to more safely and effectively communicate the materials as it will be emotionally connected. Emotional connection always wins over an impressive note or a crazy riff." We Will Rock You's Gareth Keegan asks writers to consider pacing and structure of a show. So if you have a really heavy vocal load song, they have a long time to rest after it. Really important. Now, while this presentation has been 2 years in the making, I feel like I'm very much at the beginning of my research, and I want to continue. Here are my goals. I want to continue to interview musical theater industry professionals, but I want to temper this with more concrete data. Deborah Fyland has become a close friend of mine, and she's developed a methodology of self-rating vocal function entitled EASE, the evaluation of the ability to sing easily. I'm interested in working with her to engage more Broadway and West End singers in order to grow the data on which these important narratives rest. I want to charm my way into conversations with musical directors and casting directors in London and in New York. I realize that they are reticent, but I think we need to have the ear of the entire musical theater community if we want to have something change. And to that end, I have already begun conversations with the administrative staff at Actors Equity and have every intention of showing them my findings in the hope that they will work with producers to better protect their members. What can we collectively do? First of all, we need to educate ourselves on contemporary musical theater repertoire. I know I'm not alone when I have students come in and bring things that have high Q sharps that are totally inappropriate for them. And I think it's my job to say, this isn't right for you, but how about this? It means we have to know the repertoire. And that's why I founded contemporarymusicaltheater.com. We represent over 180 writers, over 550 songs, searchable by voice and song type. This is not a paid advertisement, but come see us in booth 409. But there are other sites like repertoire.com and newmusicaltheater.com. There are plenty of sites for us to learn new music. We have to be proactive and help our students because they're going to bring in stuff that's not appropriate, and we can help them. I think we also need to understand the stylistic markers of all of these genres of musical theater because it has a lot to do with how we can bring those stylistic markers into their current vocal technique to keep them healthy. And then finally, we have to continue to demystify vocal issues. I was, again, staggered by Australia's musical theater performers and how open they were in talking about it. And I hope that that's something that we can continue to do. I feel like this organization has a real opportunity to make that happen, to make vocal issues not a taboo subject. I want to thank so many people. This has clearly been a community effort in putting this together. I, first of all, want to thank NATS for having me. I was so honored to be among such fantastic presenters. I want to thank Hope Hudson for her belief and support of me in writing my recommendation for this. I want to thank Laurie McCann, who I really admire, and thank you for introducing me. I want to thank my business partner, Laura, who's also a dear friend, and I'm going to get emotional. And I want to thank the technical staff who makes this look easy, and we know it's not. And I also want to thank all of the performers, the casting directors, the musical directors, the ENTs, the speech pathologists who took the time to have this conversation that I know will be ongoing and beneficial for us all. Thank you so much.